Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast, your guide to help you manage life, money, and multiples. Each episode, host Paul Fenner, Tama Capital's president and founder, and the proud parent of 4 amazing children, including 1 set of triplets, will provide insights on successfully sustaining an active lifestyle, career, and family through comprehensive wealth management strategies, financial education, and lifestyle planning, specific to parents raising twins, triplets, and more. Learn more, subscribe to the show, or connect with Paul at tamacapital.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of TAMA may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
When you envision retirement, what does it look like? What first comes to mind? Bucket list, freedom, the ability to do anything you want? What about the loss of identity, purpose, or relationships? Our lives are full of underrated transitions, and the transition from your career to retirement, in my mind, is one of the most critical transitions that we don't talk about enough. And I'm not talking from the financial side. I'm more concerned about the emotional side of retirement. Fortunately, Dr. Riley Moynes has done the work and built a framework that could help ease this burden of the retirement transition for those who have yet to begin the new journey to those who are in the thick of it. Riley has built what he refers to as the 4 phases of retirement. Within these phases, a retiree can go from initial jubilation to extreme loss, trying new adventures and failing, and finally reaching breakthroughs. It is this last phase of breaking through that Riley has found most retirees to be the happiest. Through his journey of going through all 4 phases, Riley shares his story of what each phase was like for him and a few stories from the hundreds of people he has interviewed through his retirement research. Be sure to listen to the end where Riley talks about how he and his wife helped to develop roots and wings in raising their 2 sons. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Riley Moynes. So Dr. Riley Moynes, welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.
Hey, my pleasure. Nice to be here, Paul. Nice to chat with you.
It was funny because we were talking before I hit record that literally I just got off the phone with one of my families 15 minutes ago, and unfortunately she's gone through a job transition and she's in her mid-60s. Financially, she's pretty solid. And the biggest homework I gave to her was your homework's going to be trying to figure out the emotional piece of preparing for retirement.
Yeah. Exactly.
And going through the things that she needs to do to focus on herself and figuring out her next steps or what those may be, and not the financial piece of it. Because I told her, I've got the financial piece. I've got you. If something was going bad, I would tell you.
Right.
But that whole, and she kept saying it over and over, that mindset shift is really, really hard. And I completely agreed with her. I think the thing is, when people, think of financial advisors, they automatically think of the stereotype numbers first.
Exactly.
And people don't realize the real value with a good financial advisor is that they will take you through these emotional transitions of life that we all, underestimate, with retirement being one of the biggest. And this belief that, okay, I hate my job, I hate my career, I want out. You're just going to flip a switch and retirement's going to be great. So my point to all that is I've been looking forward to this conversation with you for weeks now, but now it's even heightened with this new situation I have with my client. So
Right.
So let's first step back a few and have you talk to our audience about your background, who you are, what you do, because it's really interesting. Without giving too much away, you were a financial advisor that turned into an educator. So your story is a great one. So I'd love to have you share it.
Okay. Well, actually, Paul, I was an educator that turned into a financial advisor who turned back into an educator. I spent the first 20 years of my working career in public education, a few years in the classroom, but mostly kind of administratively. And at the end of 20 years, I just decided I didn't want to do this for the rest of my life. My last role as we refer to them as directors of education in Canada for the most part, in Ontario at least, and I think you often refer to them as superintendents. But my job was essentially a political role. I dealt with 19 trustees, and my goal was to ensure that when it came to major recommendations that my administrative partners brought to the board, that we had a majority. And so it really turned into a political thing, which I didn't enjoy, frankly, very much. And I decided at the end of about 20 years that I was essentially an educator at heart. I had been moving further and further away from the classroom. And I thought, well, that's what I love to do most of all. And so I decided that I would try to apply those skills in the financial services area, in the investment management area. And so I spent the next 20 years of my life doing that, building a practice and being part of some corporate combinations and so on. But essentially saw myself as an educator, helping people to make good financial decisions primarily. I wasn't aware of some of the psychological challenges that I would face. And it wasn't until I kind of stepped back from that part of my career, and I went through all the stuff that I've now tried to make sense of, but it didn't make any sense for me at all at that time. And I was really struggling. And that's really what led to my decision to try to find out more about this psychological side of retirement, the challenges and the changes that almost inevitably come with it. I went into the literature and found that, as you've noted, that most of the literature focuses on the investments and the estate planning stuff, critically important for sure, but just not what I was looking for. And so I then decided, well, the best way to get at it would be to interview as many retirees as I could. And I interviewed dozens and dozens, probably close to hundreds. And I basically asked them the question, how do you squeeze all the juice out of retirement? And with that question, of course, I had a million different answers, and I had all kinds of data. And my next job then was to try to make sense of it all and to put it into some form of more easily understood information. And that's essentially what good teachers do, I think. They take information that might at first seem to be complicated and all over the place, and to kind of pull it together into some kind of meaningful pattern. And that's really what I tried to do. And I think that I've been relatively successful at packaging it and helping people to understand the 4 critical phases of retirement.
And we're going to get into those, but I want to actually go back to a piece in your story. Mm-hmm. And this often comes up with people and reaching tipping points, if you will, for lack of a better term, is how you kind of laid out that you were unhappy on the educator side and then going into being an advisor. Mm-hmm. But for you, Riley, was there some tipping point that kind of built up, or one that was just like, you woke up one morning, I'm like, okay, I can't do this anymore. Yes. I've got to do something else? Because I think that's, and you've probably experienced this with all the people that you've talked with, that there's a real struggle to take that next step and make a change. It may be building up in you for a while, but people are definitely afraid of taking that step in the unknown, I guess.
Yeah. Well, especially if they don't know what to expect. And really, when it comes to retirement, we don't know what to expect. But to go back to your question, was there a tipping point? I guess there were 2 tipping points. I spent my last 5 years as director of education in Thunder Bay, Ontario, way up there north.
I was going to say, that sounds really north.
It is north. It's north of Minneapolis. It's north of Duluth. It's north. And so one of the tipping points was when about the middle of May, we had yet another snowstorm. And I had to I had to cancel bus transportation and close the schools in the middle of May. And the snow is covering our windows in our home. It was a blizzard. It was horrible. And my dear wife, she was finally kind of at the end of the rope as well, and she said, we've got to move on from this. So that was part of it. But the other part of it, the more political part of it, came when we were forced to close schools, as so many school boards were forced to do back at that period of time. It was the single best way, most economical way to frankly save money. And so, and of course, these school closings were always fraught with tension and acrimony. And my experience was that the best school in the world is the one that's about to be closed. So what would happen would be that for years and years, nobody cared about the school. But when it was identified as one that we were possibly going to have to close, well, all of the graduates came out of the woodwork and they said, this community could not possibly exist without this school. This school must stay open. And so there was one evening when one of our trustees, a wonderful old gentleman, he was paid a visit by a lady who lived in the area where the school was to be closed. And she came knocking on his door, and he invited her in, and she explained all the reasons why the school should stay open. And as he explained it to me later, she actually cried on my rug, Riley. She cried on my rug. And so when the time came for the vote to be taken, and he had indicated to me in the past that he recognized the need to close this school, he voted against it. And we lost the motion. The motion to close the school was lost. Hundreds of hours had been put into it, and it was a bad political decision, but it was a political decision that was made. So that was, from a political point of view, that was the tipping point for me. I just didn't want to live with this anymore. This had nothing to do with education. This was pure emotion, and I just couldn't carry on with that.
Well, good. That's a really good story.
Stayed with me all these years.
So I first found out about you and your work on these 4 phases of retirement from a gentleman by the name of Dennis Mosley Williams. And I've had Dennis on the show probably close to almost 2 years ago. He was one of my first guests, I think. Mm-hmm. And he had posted something on our community site, which happened to be your TED Talk, which has been downloaded like over 1 million times now.
That's right.
And I'll be sure to link to that in our show notes. So audience, be sure to check that out.
Yeah, thank you.
But why don't you start with what is these 4 phases of retirement that you talk about in your TED Talk?
Okay.
And how they relate to getting mentally prepared for retirement.
Right. Thank you, Paul. I'm happy to do that. Phase one, yes, I posit that there are 4 phases of retirement that almost everybody goes through. There are some exceptions, and we can talk about that later on if you like. But overwhelmingly, people go through these 4 phases of retirement. So the first phase is what I call the retirement phase. It typically lasts for about a year, perhaps 2 years. It's a time for checking off bucket list items that may have been developed over a period of years that you just couldn't get to because you didn't have time or the resources. Well, now you have the time at least, and hopefully the resources. It's a time when when there's no set routine for a change for once in your life. You'll love it. You've been guided. Your life has been dictated by a routine. And we don't always like that, but now we have an opportunity to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want, if we want, get up in the morning, go to bed at night, whenever you want, no set routine. We love that for a while. And for most people, phase 1 represents their view of an ideal retirement. Freedom, holidays, walks along the beach, travel, golf, all that stuff. It's freedom. And for most people, that's what they imagine the ideal retirement looks like. but it only lasts for a couple of years. And then we start to feel bored. We start to actually kind of miss that routine. There must be something genetically wired into us that requires a routine of some sort for most of the time. And we find ourselves asking the question, like, is that all there is to retirement? I thought it was supposed to be like this, but now I'm bored. And we put that in the context of the fact that for many people who are probably watching and listening today, many baby boomers, we're going to live up to 1/3 of our lives in retirement, quite likely 30 years of retirement. And when you're starting to feel bored after a couple of years, you know, this is a problem. And when we start to recognize that boredom and start to ask, is that all there is? Then we begin to move into phase 2. And phase 2 is when we finally come to recognize the fact that we have suffered 5 significant, almost unavoidable losses, all primarily associated with retirement. These losses are really significant. We lose our routine. Now, we didn't necessarily want to be guided by this routine, but there's something in us that needs a routine most of the time. We miss that routine. We miss, or for many people, the second loss is one of identity, because many people, males in particular, identify with their jobs or their professions or their callings. And when that is taken away from them, there is a tremendous loss of identity. And in many of my interviews, I heard people who were former teachers, accountants, lawyers, doctors, still referring to themselves as such, but they weren't. But they identify so badly with it. They don't want to lose that, but it is lost. And ultimately, we're just a guy or a gal in the street. Thirdly, we lose relationships. In many cases, work relationships have built up over years. They become lifelong friendships, and all of a sudden they're gone. And yes, I know I've done it, and I know lots of others have done it. You know, you can still go for coffee with the guys or the gals once a month or so, but it doesn't take you long to realize that they're still doing their thing. You're an outsider, and that doesn't really carry on for very long. For many people, then there's also a loss of purpose, because again, we associate our jobs in many cases with a purpose, and it's meaningful to us. And all of a sudden it's gone. And then finally, the 5th significant loss that many people experience is a loss of power, because depending on their success, perhaps, or their experience over a number of years, they may have become responsible for personnel or for a budget. And all of a sudden it's gone. So the problem here is that we don't see these losses coming, but they all happen at the same time. And it's kind of like, poof, gone. And it is very, very traumatic for most people. Now, at the same time, and to make things even worse in phase 2, and phase 2 is really the bottom of the barrel for most of us. At the same time, there are the 3 Ds. Now, they're not necessarily associated directly with retirement, but they tend to happen about this time of our life. So there's the likelihood of depression. The Mayo Clinic, the world famous Mayo Clinic, has concluded that there is a 40% likelihood that on retirement, we are going to experience aspects of clinical depression. 40% likelihood. Depression is not unknown at all at this time of our lives. Maybe associated with retirement, but not necessarily. Secondly, the second D is decline, both physical and mental decline. It just happens. And thirdly, there is a significant increase in divorce at this time of life. It was astounding to me to learn this, but a much larger likelihood of divorce in our 50s and 60s than I would have imagined.
Do you think that's because, and this is actually a concern that I started reading research on this too, Riley. It got me really concerned, especially with the families I work with that are in their 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I know how hard it is raising my set of triplets plus one right now. That Teresa and I, my wife, we hardly have, sometimes we're just passing ships in the night. It's really hard to communicate.
Yeah,
and we're so busy raising our kids, trying to run the family.
Yeah.
They get all grown. And then you look at your spouse or significant other and like, who are you? Like, where did you go?
Yeah. Well, that seems to be that's a reality. So when you put it all together, when you put these 5 losses associated with retirement, plus the 3 Ds that are associated probably with this time of our life, you can appreciate how phase 2 is a very, very difficult time. And another astounding figure that I've come across, the highest rate of suicide in North America today is men over 75. Shocking.
Wow.
Shocking. So phase 2 is a very difficult time for many, many people. Fortunately, however, at some point, we say to ourselves or our spouses or someone, hey, I can't go on like this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life, which may well be 30 years or so, feeling like this. And that's a good sign. When that happens, we've turned a corner to phase 3, which is the trial and error phase. That's when we ask ourselves questions like, hey, what can I do to feel that I'm contributing again, to make my life meaningful again the way it used to be? What is it that's going to make me want to get up again in the morning and kind of get involved? And as I say, that's a good sign that we're starting to ask those questions. And so trial and error involves then trying different things that we think might appeal to us, that might help us make our lives feel meaningful again. But again, I have to point out that trial and error, lots of false starts, quite likely in phase 3. I could probably cite a dozen false starts that I personally experienced in phase 3. But the important thing is that you've got to keep going. You've got to keep trying, because if you don't, what's the option? The option is quite likely slipping back into phase 2. And that is not a pretty sight. Not a pretty sight. So trial and error is phase 3. You've got to keep at it to find something that will match the things that you do well, things that you love to do, things that have led you to success in the past. These are the kinds of things that we need to keep working hard on. That's phase 3. Phase 4. Not everyone reaches phase 4. In fact, I estimate that probably, and it's a figure that's lower than I would like it to be, but I believe that about 60 to 65% of retirees get to phase 4. Some people stay in phase 1, some unfortunately in phase 2. They may be part of that statistic that I cited. Some stay in phase 3, some kind of move back and forth among them. But those people who reach phase 4 are among the happiest people I have ever known. It's almost like they're vibrating with excitement. They know what it is what makes them want to get up in the morning again, and they can't wait for the morning to come up and do it. I've spoken to so many people, one just last week at a presentation that I was making, where the fellow was saying, I don't have enough hours in the day to do all the things I want to do. I do this, I volunteer here. It's wonderful to be associated with those people, for sure. So it's worth the effort, but it requires asking ourselves some tough questions, like, what is it that I love to do? What is it that I do really well? And what are some of the things that I do that have led me to success in the past? And so by thinking about these things, and frankly, we're not really very good at introspection. It's
Right.
we just don't take the time for this, but you have to take the time to break through to phase 4, in my experience. And when you can kind of recall and when you become more aware of the things that you love to do and do well and have led to success in the past, those are the kinds of things that can direct your attention to a particular area. So I call it not retiring in the traditional sense, but kind of rewiring, taking those skills, abilities, passions, and perhaps applying them in a different area than you might have before, but they can still give you tremendous satisfaction.
So I may have missed this. What do you call phase 4? Do you have a name for it?
Well, phase 4 is when we kind of break through and reinvent.
Okay.
Break through and reinvent.
So thank you for laying all that out. So now I get to my $1 million question.
Yeah.
How, Riley, did you come up with this? Like,
Yeah.
what was I guess walk us through like what the process was in your thoughts of how you actually came up with these 4.
Okay. Well, again, Paul, thank you for asking. I appreciate your interest in the work that I've been doing. It is very exciting to me, and I do hope it's making a difference.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, and I know the audience will as well. I think this is a very, as I mentioned in our intro and talking to each other, it's a very undiscussed topic that, to your point, especially in this phase 2 of losses where people can literally like lose themselves.
Yeah.
It's really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my answer would be, as a teacher, I know, pardon me, I know that a significant part of the role is to take information that might at first appear to be complicated, difficult, unconnected, and somehow to kind of bring it all together in some kind of a framework or a context that can help that can help make it more understandable for people. So I went through all of these phases, but I didn't know what they represented. I didn't know what they were. And for me, one of the worst things was that I didn't know that there was another step. I love phase 1, but it didn't last very long. I had real challenges in phase 2. And in fact, part of those challenges were what inspired me to try to find out more, because it didn't make sense to me at all. But as I got more and more of these input from people and their stories, I began to develop a kind of a pattern that made sense in my experience, but also as I kind of fed it back to people, made sense for them as well. And one of the most gratifying things that I've seen with respect to the TED Talk is hundreds and hundreds of comments who have said things like, dead on, that's me, that's what happened to me. And so it gives me increased confidence that the 4 phases do resonate with people. They can relate to them. It made sense for me and it helped me. And the big thing for me in making my presentations, whether it be the TED Talk or whether it be my book of the same title, is that people can see that there is an answer, that there is a way out of some of the things that they're feeling. And I hope that they understand that it requires effort. You can't just sit by and let things happen to you. You've got to make it happen, or else there's a very good chance that you could just find yourself mired in phase 2 or 3 or wherever it might be.
I'm actually glad that you brought us back here, because I wanted to ask a question on that. Is with the hundreds of people that you've talked with regarding, putting this together.
Yeah.
How do people find their way through this? And let me try to even be a little bit more specific. Like, it kind of goes back to how I ask you, okay, what was your tipping point when you decided to leave education and go into being a financial advisor.
Right.
Is there a silver bullet or secret sauce that people can take away that that I don't want to use the word forces, but nudges them? That's probably the right word. Nudges them to make the time for themselves. Because going back to the example I shared with my client earlier, that was one thing I really stressed to her was like, you've got to make the time to do this for you.
Yes.
This is your life.
Yes. Yes. If there's a silver bullet, and I wouldn't presume that that's what I'm offering, but for me, when there is a framework, it's helpful to me. So to me, the biggest contribution that I can make is to provide people with a framework that represents a very high likelihood of what they will experience. So for people who are retired, I ask them to determine for themselves, what phase are you in? And depending on where that is, what do you need to do to move forward? Assuming you want to move forward. I mean, I have met a very small number of people who say that they are blissfully happy in phase one. And who am I to challenge that? To me, there's not much. I mean, it's very egocentric. It's all about me. And there's a time for that. But one of the major things that I discovered in my interviews, Paul, was that one of the things that kept coming up was that people, in one way or another, they received the greatest sense of accomplishment or achievement or gratification out of providing service to others.
And that's research. All the research I read on happiness, on fulfillment, it always comes back to that. Like,
absolutely,
being of service to others is one of the easiest ways to make your life happier.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's good for everyone, right? You're helping yourself, you're helping others. Tremendous sense of accomplishment in doing that. And I mean, it doesn't have to be, sometimes when people talk about service to others, they assume it's a volunteer kind of thing. Well, it could be, but there's nothing wrong with being paid for providing service to others either. You're still providing service. And so people, I think, should maybe look beyond the concept that implies that it might just be a volunteer kind of thing that brings them this sort of gratification or sense of satisfaction. Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to sum up by saying, Paul, I think that by offering a framework, it provides hope for people. People who are retired can place themselves where they are. For people who are not yet retired, I find they have told me that it's helpful in giving them a heads up as to what to expect.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And again, this is why this is going to be a required listening homework assignment for that client, because with what you're talking about, it nails everything that she's going through right now. So let me kind of shift back and ask, because your work is getting well known. Obviously, to have a TED Talk get downloaded over 1 million times is pretty remarkable. How did that come about? Like, how did the TED Talk come about? And has it surprised you on how viral it's gone?
Yeah. It's I mean, who knows how these things happen, but at some point, someone had been given a copy of my book, The 4 Phases of Retirement. They happened to know someone who knew someone who was involved with the TEDx organization in Vancouver. And they suggested to this person who is in some way connected that this might be an interesting topic. Their overall theme is ideas worth sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt that this was an idea worth sharing. So I was contacted and I was asked if I would be interested in applying to possibly be a TED speaker. And this was back in 2021, or I guess actually late 2020. And so it would have been, perhaps it would have happened in 2021. Long story short, I was selected as one of the 12 speakers for 2021. But because of COVID, I was unable to travel to Vancouver to deliver the talk. So that was a discouragement, a disappointment. They came back the next year, would you like to consider it again? And I thought, do I really want to go through all that again? It had been a grind and hundreds of hours involved, but wonderful coaching. Anyway, again, long story short, I was accepted as one of the 12 and I was able to travel this time. So the actual presentation took place in mid-February. And then it wasn't until I guess late May that it was released on YouTube. I'm as shocked as anybody else by the reception. I mean, I'm very gratified, of course, that it has resonated so widely. I've spoken to people all around the world: South Africa, Iceland, Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., Canada. It's been very gratifying to speak with people who are doing similar kind of work or who felt that it resonated. It's been wonderful. But you put these things out there and you really have no idea as to how they'll be received. And so again, I clearly the topic resonates. It's timely. And I'm just so grateful that we may have been able to make a bit of a contribution along the way.
So has it changed your marriage at all? Like is knowing that your wife is your wife is, or you're now married to a rock star, like what's your wife's take on this?
She keeps me grounded, do the dishes, right? Take out the garbage. Come on. Nothing's changed here at all. No, it hasn't impacted in that regard at all. Thanks.
Well, I definitely think that your ideas, your framework, I think that's the really great way to put this. An idea is completely worth spreading. So I'm glad that you made the time for me and my audience. So that kind of brings me to my closing question that I ask all of our guests is in talking about your family.
Yep.
What is typically a lot of our listeners are parents, whether they're older parents that have kids off to college or now are grown adults, or like me that are in the grade school, middle school years, or have kids that are infants. But what is the best thing about being a parent?
I've thought about that question, and I would we have two sons, both of whom are approaching 50 years of age. It's hard to fathom that one, I'll tell you. But I would say that the best thing about being a parent in our experience is that we always tried to give our kids roots and wings. And my wife and I that was kind of a mantra that we used over and over again. And we tried to judge almost everything that we did, every kind of major initiative with the kids against that measure. And is this something that's going to give them roots? Is it going to give them wings? And so we're very gratified by the fact that we think that we can see both of our sons having roots and having taken wing. And we have one son who lives way across the country, and we have another son who has embarked on he's a financial advisor as well. He could have taken over my practice, but he told me one day he didn't want to work with old people like I worked with. And so he started absolutely from ground zero, and he works now almost exclusively with professional athletes, mostly hockey players, mostly NHL hockey players and coaches. So he has his own roots, and we've given them wings, and that's been the most gratifying for us.
Well, I love in the almost 2 years I've had the show now. I love asking that question because the answers are always unique, always diversified, and I always take away something from that. And obviously this is no different because I just wrote down roots and wings. So can't wait to share that one with Teresa. But Dr. Riley Moynes, thank you so much for spending the time with us on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. And really thank you for the work that you've done in putting together this framework. Be sure I will be for our audience, be sure to check out the show notes with this episode, the link to Riley's TED Talk, and also his book, The 4 Phases, will be in there. So definitely look at that information. So Riley, I can't thank you enough. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast. Please visit tamacapital.com to subscribe to this podcast or to connect with certified financial planner and registered investment advisor Paul Fenner of Tama Capital. And please join us again next time on the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.